Hello and welcome. This is News Club UK, a weekly panel show that doesn't just talk about the same old, same old. I'm your host, Thomas Barlow, and this week I am joined by Baroness Fox. Claire Fox is the director of the Academy of Ideas, author of I Find That Offensive, former MEP, and now Baroness Fox of Buckley. Abla Kandalaft, who is a journalist, translator, and film programmer. As a journalist and researcher, she specializes in long form and investigative work, labor relations, Middle East politics, and film. And Sam Walby is editor-in-chief at Now Then magazine in Sheffield. And we've got a long description about all of these guys in the description of the show. Please do check them out, plus their links to their socials. They're great, but I've been told my intros are too long, so we're going to move on quickly. This week, we are going to be talking about curfews and lockdowns, councils and inquiries, mercenaries and coups. But let's start off with the highlight of the show, let's be honest, Baroness Fox and lockdowns, because we're going to get a great taste of Barlow being a knobhead, as you see every week if you've been following this show. And this is going to be just the same. We are going to be talking about Mark Drayford getting barred from 100 North Wales pubs over the looming alcohol ban. Now, I believe we have a clip of Baroness Fox in the House of Lords delivering a speech around both the situation in Wales and also on the recent bill that was put forward to people. If we can play that clip, that'd be great.
But is that true? Because surely in emergency, more than ever, politicians could do with a hand. And I urge ministers to draw on the resources, the intellect, the intuition, the common sense and the intelligent criticisms of millions of people in order to move forward. But I want you for a minute to imagine what it feels like to be in Wales at the moment. They've endured a lockdown, and their reward from Welsh Labour is a 6 p.m. curfew, more Puritan prohibition than science, with utter indifference to the destruction of hospitality jobs. By the way, a shout out to the 100 North Wales publicans who banned the First Minister from pubs for 18 months. Hear, hear to them. But it illustrates the infuriating way that citizens are treated, victims of arbitrary diktats from on high and never involved in any debate. You might disagree with me, my lord. You think I'm mad? That's good. Start to a civilised debate. Anyway, all this is unnecessary and not the way we should move forward. Because I think that the technocratic approach is bad for science and bad for democracy. Science is in danger of being turned into a set-in-stone tablet and a dogma. The very strength of the scientific method is about challenging and testing hypotheses and is being corrupted by an adherence to the science. And then those scientists who raise concerns about the official narrative have their professional reputations traduced as fake experts, shills, their interviews censored, dubbed in some misinformation, and heckled as mad. But surely, with a new virus, we need to hear all scientific views, not just those of SAGE, and all scientists, pro and anti-lockdown, should be prepared to have their work rigorously scrutinised and critiqued, and none should be silenced, or important questions won't even be asked, let alone answered.
So let me just read you through a little bit of the article before we bring in Baroness Fox to have a chinwag about this. This is from the article from, I believe, Wales Online today, or the Daily Post, in fact. Mark Drayford barred from 100 North Wales pubs over looming alcohol ban. Wales First Minister has been banned from more than 100 pubs in North Wales following his announcement of strict new rules for the industry. The West Conway Pub Watch group said Mark Drayford would be banned from entering their members' premises for at least 18 months. It comes after Mr. Drakeford unveiled new rules for the hospitality industry in a bid to stem the rising tide of coronavirus in Wales. They include a ban on alcohol sales in hospitality settings and a 6 p.m. curfew. The decision has sparked fury from business owners within the industry, and now the West Conway Pub Watch Group has taken matters further. He has now been banned from scores of premises, with Pub Watch organisers saying more than 300 hospitality businesses have said they would lend their support to the move. So We can bring in Claire here, and now it begins some of the awkward questions. I wanted to ask you this, and I think it's a fair question if awkwardly phrased. Why this attack on the Welsh government? What is wrong with this policy? Isn't it just cheap reactionary populism to attack policies that aim to protect the public services and citizens' health? Isn't that what they're there to do?
Well, why the attack on the Welsh government is because I'm from Wales. Buckley is in Wales, and all my family, many and friends who live in Wales, many of them have gone along with a lot of the lockdown measures. They were shocked by the firebreak lockdown. It seemed to be particularly punitive, but they put up with it and they tolerated it, and they've come out of it only to be faced with what can only be described as policies which bear very little relationship to protecting the public. I mean, this is going to destroy jobs. That's the first thing. Secondly, it is Puritan. I mean, the no alcohol ban, there's no scientific evidence for any of this having any effect whatsoever. And I think the whole of lockdown, I mean, you say it's populist. I mean, does that mean it's popular? I mean, there is something to be said for noting that what is done on behalf of the people from on high by Mark Drakeford doesn't necessarily mean that we should all nod along to it, or that it's done actually in the best interest of people, because the Welsh economy is being decimated, and one should at least be able to ask whether the measures are proportionate or not. Nobody's talking about wandering around letting it rip, as the caricature is often said, or that it's mad. It's quite a straightforward attempt at saying there has to be ways that we have to learn to live with this virus that do not mean that ordinary people's lives are utterly destroyed for generations to come.
Well, the alcohol ban is in hospitality settings. It's not like you can't drink at home. And
very good of them. Very good of them. I mean, that's where conviviality happens.
A public health attempt. And the problem isn't the problem for Welsh Labour. And here's my concern that I'd like to follow up about why it's odd to pick on Welsh Labour and say, not for instance, the Conservative MP who's been banned from Warrington pubs, or indeed the fact that in Manchester, where I live, we're on tier 3 lockdown rules when places in the country that have far higher rates of infection are on tier 2 or tier 1, which seems to be a reaction by the central government against Manchester for standing up for its rights. It seems to me that you're not picking on the people who could economically help out the people of Wales, because what the Welsh Labour have is an unfunded mandate. They have to protect citizens' health, but they don't have the money to be able to protect the economy at the same time. I agree that there are problems with protecting the economy, but surely if their first instinct is to protect health, that should be lauded. And that's why
first of all, the whole speech was an attack on the government, right? Mm-hmm. You've taken the clip about North Wales. I know, because you asked me to choose a news story, and it had just happened, and I'm from Wales. I mean, God, come on, that's a setup. Otherwise, the whole speech was an attack on the government. I also drew attention to what had happened in Wales that day, because it had happened that day, and it seemed pertinent to illustrate the point. Because actually, one of the problems I've got with Labour is their only opposition is to say we should have harder lockdowns. And the only thing that they demand, and in this instance, by the way, the only thing they demand is often more funding, which is not the same as keeping a productive economy open. Because funding, it's not just about money, it's about quality of life, the kind of life you lead. And in this instance, in the case of the pubs in Wales, because they are being allowed to be open, but not serve alcohol, they can't even furlough their staff. Right. So actually, it's got nothing to do with Welsh funding. Similarly, Wales have, for example, brought in mandated mask wearing for all secondary school pupils in every part. That's got nothing to do with funding. That's just draconian and illiberal. Right. So the idea that I can't attack Labour if I'm going to prove that I'm not avoiding attacking the government, when the whole premise of my anti-lockdown point is to be anti-lockdown, not sectarian about any one particular party. That is the point of raising these issues, because lockdown is, in my view, a disproportionate, illiberal measure that is not related, is not going to be able to help us get out of this mess. And you say about protecting health. First of all, it's a decision that this is the best way to protect health. It is not the only way that you can protect health. And the health of the nation is not the only consideration. There are other values involved, but health, as it happens in Wales, is suffering very badly. If you're going to talk about Wales, 5 out of 7 of the health authorities in Wales are in special measures, and that's not to do with funding. It has nothing to do with funding in that instance. And I think it's appropriate. What I'm saying is it's got nothing to do with COVID. It's a badly run administration, right? So if they were so concerned about health, they might have sorted out the hospitals before we ever got to a COVID crisis. So I'm pointing out...
age of austerity, isn't that the...
No, it's not. No. It's the same age of austerity. Well, it's not an age of austerity. One of my objections is that the Welsh government in this instance, but the UK government overall, so they're all involved in this, are bringing about a policy-driven recession that is coming from the way they are dealing with COVID. That is the problem. If you shut down the productive economy, which is what they've done, you actually are ensuring that jobs will be lost forever. It's not a question of just having, as Manchester demanded, more furlough money. It's a question of the viability of anybody's capacity to run any kind of a company or a firm, and jobs will go for a long time to come. So you can get your furlough money, but there won't be any jobs at the end of it. And productive life and being at work is not just about money either, because actually it's to do with your sense of meaning for yourself. People are going to be demoralized. They are already utterly frustrated to have to sit there and listen to politicians dictate and micromanage every aspect of their life. Is making what is a serious pandemic that much worse for people, in my view.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, isn't the problem not necessarily the lockdowns themselves? You've outlined some elements of it, obviously the destruction of economic capacity, the effects on our quality of life. But surely in highlighting the problems around lockdowns, we should highlight the problems around the government's shoddy handling of the crisis through their corrupt nepotism, because what we clearly probably needed was a decent track and trace system and local expertise that was employed to utilize that and other measures. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about that we should focus on instead of lockdowns? Or is it really that you just don't want lockdowns full stop?
Well, I don't think lockdown, the first lockdown I supported, I think we didn't know enough about the virus. I can understand a temporary suspension of civil liberties. I do care about freedom and civil liberties, and I do think that it's appropriate that we are ever vigilant when the state accrues to itself a huge amount of power. And, for just to use one example, there was a mental health aspect of the coronavirus bill that actually meant that you could section people with on the whim of one doctor, entirely draconian policy, which, by the way, the government has just rolled back on. Guess where hasn't? Wales. I mean, why? I mean, that's one of the things that was most egregious and should have gone. But on your point about corruption and cronyism, of course, it's appropriate to point that out. I mean, there's so many things that one could point out by the way that the government have handled this that I think is inappropriate. And I think cronyism is one issue. But on some of it, I think you have to be careful about the moral high ground, because at the beginning of this, there were demands, if you remember, from every opposition politician that, PPE be made available now, straight away, didn't matter where you got it from, all the kind of usual scrutiny. We can all look back and say, well, I don't know why you didn't just, go through the proper processes. Well, there was a panic, that's why. And actually, the government were under a huge amount of pressure to deliver now, yesterday, if not beforehand. And so I think they went to their mates. I don't think that's right, but I just think you've got to understand what happened. And you can laugh.
What happened, it isn't, it isn't right. Like, I mean,
no, it isn't.
Especially when they've got a history of failing to deliver.
It isn't, but I'm not. But I don't understand your inability to understand that each and every single political party is compromised by the way they've responded to COVID. And Tory bashing is the simplest thing to do at the moment.
I'm government bashing. I'm not, and I'm
government bashing. Fine. I was interested, and I therefore am interested in the fact that you object to me government bashing when it comes to Wales, because I'm Welsh and I'm therefore government bashing. But that apparently is not right.
I asked you the question, you answered it.
Fine.
Okay, like, so I'm saying I don't want to bash anyone.
Question as an objection. Like I'm not. You know,
I don't know the
flaws across the country.
But exactly. So we should note those flaws across the country. But I'm saying that I think there's been serious problems. I actually didn't think that Andy Burnham was turned into some kind of a hero at one point, and I was shocked. It was great that he stood up to the government in terms of saying we shouldn't be in tier 3, but he was demanding, or a heavier tier, but he was demanding lockdowns. And I've said to you, I think that is actually the most draconian way of dealing with this. So it didn't feel to me as though he was actually having a proportionate reaction to what should happen. I also felt, I do feel as though the kind of regional competition between some of the mayors has been a bit unsavoury, to be honest. And I write for the Municipal Journal, local government magazine, and it seems to me that council leaders have sort of gone along with the government and simply just ask for more money, which, you know, you talk about cronyism. I mean, if it can be bought that easily, I want there to be a political challenge to the government.
Advocating for the people they represent.
No, they're asking for money for their own authorities.
This isn't personal profit. Like Nicholas Soames, grandson of Churchill and, like, you know, brother of an MP, reported a 53% rise in half-year trading, like a couple of months ago.
But I don't think it's right.
Being able to deliver on anything that they promised to do.
But I don't think it's right. I don't think it's right, though. I know that all those Serco things have gone up. Yeah, fine. But I don't think it's right. But if you run, no, that's fine. That's a good example. But if you run a local authority, if you're as powerful as somebody like Andy Burnham is, right, accruing money for your particular fiefdom is also partly, it doesn't matter whether it's personal or not. I'm making
boats, surely.
I'm making no. If you seriously think that giving money to councils finds its way into the pockets of the poorest people of the region, you're either naive or you're not following. I mean, that's not the way it happens. I'm just saying.
Like, I'm not naive. I'm totally against the Manchester Council. But here's how bad Serco and the cronies that the Tories used. I would rather 100 times over local councils be given the cash and the responsibility to carry out the test and trace program, and local health authorities to do it.
I agree with that.
Than the corporations that fleeced us all.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah. I don't disagree with you on that at all.
I'm not happy about, you know, like I don't laud anyone particularly, but it's an example of whereby we're in a situation where we're having to rely on someone that we don't even particularly like in our own city to stand up for us to deliver a better service because we can't trust central government.
That's fine, and that's on track and trace. But I don't necessarily know that track and trace is the only way out of this. And what I think has happened is that throughout, I mean, when we call on people for lockdowns, right, and when, for example, we say that this is the only way that furlough or more money in the local area is the only way that people will survive this. What I'm saying is that people's livelihoods and their capacity to be autonomous, free individuals has been completely compromised. And I'm disappointed not to have heard more of those political objections to what the Tories are doing from the opposition benches, because they seem to me, the policies of all of the parties are identical. They just vary in terms of how they would deliver them, but there's been no substantial challenge. It seems to me, I haven't heard any from, you know, I find it galling that the only people who are opposing the government are Tory backbenchers, and they've called them out far more effectively. What were the Labour Party doing when they abstained in the House of Commons the other night, for goodness sake? I mean, do they not have a view? Is this playing politics? We're in a very serious situation.
You call me naive? Of course, they're playing politics.
Yes, and I'm saying that this is a dereliction of duty. I don't need to be told how bad the Tories are. I know that, but therefore you have to ask, what kind of opposition do they face? And I'm suggesting that if the opposition they face from the opposition benches, which what I'm more interested in, is coming from, you know, from the left-ish, I wouldn't mind the alleged pro-working class party to show a bit of regard
for the plight of the working class, because I think they've been absolutely shafted by the Labour Party, who seem to not understand that, first of all, the invisible frontline workers have had to carry on working throughout all this, that furlough doesn't pay them, that it's not just about money, that going for a drink in a pub somehow is deemed to be an unsafe activity. I mean, you were saying you can drink at home. Great, you know, we're going to be confined to our houses. I mean, going to the pub can be part of civil society, for a start off. Is where you meet your mates, is where you actually have collective chats about things. They don't want that to happen. They're banning it from happening, and that's not, you know, our best interests in terms of our mental health, never mind our health. It's got absolutely nothing to do with stopping you getting coronavirus unless they're going to lock us up forever.
Well, I have two further questions, and I appreciate the back and forth here. But one will get to some solutions in the end, so that's where we're going to end up on, and I'd really like to talk about those and get into those. But I do want to come back to something about the public health aspect of this, which is about COVID mortality rates, because it does affect the poor far more than it does rich elites, right? And, you know, and disproportionately communities of color, women, people who have asthma, pre-existing conditions, people with learning disabilities, and people with mental health issues as well. So really at-risk populations are suffering more high-level mortality from COVID directly, as well as indirectly by some of these measures of lockdown. Now, here's where I have a serious question for you, which is in opposing lockdowns and imposing on the grounds that seem very reasonable and pro individual freedom, which I have a lot of sympathy for. We have to then ask you, you know, how many people is it okay to die of COVID in order for us to open the pubs? I mean, where are we at here? How do we make this choice?
Well, the very people that you're describing are the people who've had to carry on working throughout this anyway. Yeah. So they are the ones who are servicing the lockdowns. You know, all these people who sit around going, well, what's wrong with working from home? I mean, I haven't got a bloody clue. I mean, I remember at the beginning when all these kind of lefty commentators were saying, well, I don't know who all these people are on the tube. What are they doing? We're all meant to be locked down. You think, they're going to work. Lots of jobs do not involve sitting in front of a computer. And when they say the wonders of working at home, they obviously don't live in a kind of flat that I'm talking about. So
they've been
that's what and lockdowns are service.
You want to increase that threat.
I'm saying lockdowns are service. No, I'm saying lockdowns are being serviced by those people. So actually being anti-lockdown, right, is not about, you know, you can be pro-lockdown and those people are still vulnerable. You can be anti-lockdown and those people are still vulnerable. Now we're going to have a conversation about whether it is the case that poorer people have a worse health outcome. Yes, guess what? No surprise there on anything and everything, right? That's why I don't like poverty. It's a bit of a no-brainer, which is one of the reasons why I'm particularly concerned about the impoverished way that people are going to have to live their lives as a consequence of lockdowns. Because you can say it's indirect, and you can say, well, people are dying. I mean, you will know that we haven't taken any account of those vulnerable groups. I mean, if you have a generalized lockdown, you don't have, I mean, this is exactly what happened the first time. Those people who, for example, in institutional care, in care homes, you know, the elderly and so on, especially elderly in their homes, the care workers who had to visit those elderly in their homes, they suddenly got forgotten because there was such a clamour for lockdown for everyone. So the very people that you would want us to pay attention to got lost in the morass, right? And we know that they were the vulnerable people. So I've got no objection whatsoever, and I've never argued that we should take no attention of those people who might be more susceptible to COVID. And I also think that if you're worried about the health outcomes for those people who are socially in weak positions, socially deprived, poor, and so on, what you should do is ensure that you don't impoverish them further by your policies, which is what is happening. They are losing their jobs, their livelihoods, 0 hours contractors. They're going mad. Even the pleasures of life are demonized as somehow libertine and illegitimate. And it's in that context that I think if you get a holistic picture, you'll realize that actually the impact of this,
Are they
hardly anybody
are they saying that actually people who are already vulnerable and at risk, people who are essential workers, are going to be further threatened by the fact that the virus will spread due to opening public places for people to spread the virus further? Ultimately, it's not a puritanical attack on
first of all,
drink or be around people.
Yeah, I know, but first of all,
the events I want all the places.
The virus, as you'll know, disproportionately affects particularly over 50s, actually over 60s, over 70s, and so on. So the majority of the population are under 50, right? And particularly young working class people, if you're going to go down the class route, right? So why are they locked up? Why is everyone locked up? So what I'm talking about is having a more targeted approach. And on this one, you know, Burnham was right. There's geographical targeting approach. There are protecting the vulnerable. You could discuss that. The point is that you're not allowed to discuss that, because then everybody just says, well, if we have any more liberalization, you're going to damage things. I'm saying that the damage that is being done to the health as well as the wealth of the poorest people in society is far outweighs the risk to them of this virus. I'm not trying to minimize that the virus is a risk, by the way. I'm not saying it is not a risk. I'm saying that for most people, catching the virus is not a lethal threat. But for those people that catch the virus where it can be a lethal threat, they need to be protected. Now, in the midst of all this, as you will know, there are many other health conditions that are sorely being neglected, and people are dying disproportionately. And particularly, again, this has a social impact in areas where the health service is not well resourced and not well run. So if you happen to have cancer, or you're not detected as having cancer, heart disease, those people who are in homes who have dementia, who are undoubtedly dying an earlier death, not of COVID, but of neglect, literal neglect. People going into hospitals. I don't know if you've dealt with that hospitals, but one of the things that you know when somebody you love or know goes into hospital is often you have to go in to ensure that they're getting their drinks regularly and so on. No one's allowed to go into a hospital anymore. So what you've got is, and that's because health workers are stretched, and often families provide a little extra barrier there to protect people's health. I'm saying if you only see contemporary society through the eyes of COVID, only through the eyes of COVID, right, you go down a kind of rabbit hole of that's the only thing you have to deal with. I'm suggesting that COVID is a very serious challenge to society, but our reaction to it in terms of political terms has meant that we have created far greater and deeper problems for the majority of ordinary people in this country.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, if we look at places that reacted to it well, pretty much everywhere in the world outside of the US has reacted to it better than us. Obviously, you're looking at New Zealand that sort of basically had a zero COVID policy, which was, extreme lockdown and then track and trace, and it was very effective. But you're looking, according to Global Citizen, at Senegal being second, like in terms of having mobile track and trace stations, mobile treatment centers, because they dealt with Ebola, maybe they were better prepared. But it seems to me that we've been extremely under-resourced and underprepared, but also that the reaction has shown incompetence, negligence, cronyism, and that at this point they're trying to keep the lid on a mortality rate that could explode due to activities that we all love and want to be able to participate in. And as I say, as someone who works in the events industry, or used to, and is now jobless and on the dole, right, I'd love to see my industry being cared for. We would have been fine if we were given the capital to keep going to 1 year, but we've not been given that. We've not had any economic protections that people who are employed are, and self-employed people have struggled really, really heavily. And that's when we've got a country with 5.1 million small to medium enterprises and so forth. So in this situation, I have sympathy for a lot of the points that you're making. But I do have a final question. I know we've gone on a little bit too long, but I'm going to bring in for one more, which is, what are the precautions then that the government should be taking to protect public services and the health of the working class, essential workers who keep society going? What is it that it should be doing? You're saying nuanced in what way? Like if there's different levels of doing this, different ways of doing it, you're saying not regionally, or you're saying definitely local government should be allowed to tackle it the way they want, or, what are we saying here? Oh, Vicky, mute. Sorry.
First of all, I think that I do think that the vaccine is very good news. So that's one thing, and how that is delivered and who it's delivered to will be essential. Although I think that the mandating of vaccine use will backfire and lead to people reacting against it. So we have to be careful about that. I am still very anxious about particularly the vulnerable groups and the groups who are most at risk from it, often in hospitals, in fact, and in care homes and so on. I still don't think are being properly catered for. So I'm talking about a more targeted approach. And, you've said some of the points about mobile track and trace. My queries are, and I don't think they've been answered at all by the government, is, how effective are the testing? What do they say about false positives? How do we know that when people get the virus, how soon does that mean that they're immune? All of these questions would allow us to return to some form of normality sooner rather than later. But my broader point, I still maintain, is that the health of ordinary people is being detrimentally damaged for a long time to come, both by our reaction to it, because I think it is bad for our health to be confined to barracks, for us to be segregated from each other, for there to be no social activity. And I don't just mean opening up events industries, like that's what the Academy of Ideas does. I'm not talking about it just from that point of view. I mean in terms of our capacity to we all know that we're stronger together. We all know that basically isolating people, and I would have thought that you'd have been keen on, our capacity to have some collective reaction. The fact that demonstrations are banned during this period. It's not that I want to go on a demonstration of anti-lockdown, as it might well be made up of a load of cranks, but the danger to us, those of us who are likely to be dissidents in any kind of a future, is that what we've done is we've knocked the stuffing out of the working class. We basically told them that they've got to shut up and put up and sit on the couch and listen to what the politicians and their experts tell us. And I'm suggesting to you that
I think the broader point has been made.
But if that carries on, it will mean that the health of the very people that you care about will be damaged far more than by any virus. That is the point I'm making.
The people I care about, I'm included in them. So the broader point stands, and it's a welcome addition to the debate. And I think relatively it has a lot of merits, though I still think ultimately we're in a situation where the incompetence leading to this point has put us in a situation where we are where we are. But we have every right to be frustrated. And in talking about frustrations in a really awkward and terribly put together segue, I'm going to move us on to another part. Thank you, Claire, for going back and forth on this. Now, we've got an excellent piece that's been brought to light by Abla Kandalaft, who is an excellent journalist who runs My Dialorama, which is a partner of the Media Fund, and you can check out the links in the description. Now, she's brought to light a BBC piece that has been brought up in reported on in the last couple of days, which is British mercenaries are to be investigated over Sri Lanka war crimes. Now, British mercenaries who were involved in the Sri Lankan Civil War are being investigated for war crimes by the Metropolitan Police. Private security company Kini Mini Services trained an elite unit of Sri Lankan police called the Special Task Force in the 1980s to fight Tamil separatists. The STF has been implicated in a number of human rights abuses. These have included executions without trial and killings of Tamil civilians. The investigation is believed to be the first time British mercenaries have been investigated by the Met, which is the UK force responsible for investigating accusations of war crimes or human rights abuses. A police spokesperson said the Met had received a referral in March concerning allegations of war crimes committed by British mercenaries, and following a scoping exercise, it had launched an investigation. The reason we bring this up is because Abla, who I'm going to bring in now, did an interview with the author of the book on this organisation, whose book provides a lot of the evidence for the referral. The book is called Kini Minis. It's by Phil Miller. Hello, Abla. How are you doing today? Oh, we've got you on mute again, Vicky, if we can sort that out. So let me ask a question for you while you're still muted, which is...
I can unmute myself.
Was it?
There we go.
Oh, right. Okay, glorious. There we go. It's good to have autonomy, right? Individual control over your decisions. That's what we want. So I've got to ask, right? Mercenaries have to do what they have to do, and sometimes they operate in places where the government can't, right? Isn't this an extreme measure to take against a mercenary outfit? They were, after all, only advisors and trainers. They can't be held responsible for what the troops did on the ground, surely.
Well, okay, so for a start, they are representatives of the British interests in the region. So we can actually go back to make a point about British intervention and whether that's justified or not, but we'll leave that aside for the time being. You're asking why are they being held responsible for those crimes as opposed to, I assume you mean the Sri Lankan military unit. So I'll refer you to the case against them. So this goes back, and again, credit to Phil Miller. I'm not the one who's discovered any of this. I found out through my interview with him and through having watched his excellent documentary. So what happened was the Tamil Information Centre used Miller's findings and referred these to the United Nations Working Group on Mercenaries. And they then wrote to the British Foreign Office highlighting these allegations against Kini Mini Services. Now, one of those allegations was that Kini Mini Services, now I'm going to quote a bit of that paper that they've given the United Nations that then went on to highlight it to the Foreign Office, was that KMS specifically had carried out armed helicopter assaults, including this incident. I'm going to read it out. It's on the 7th of June 1986, a KMS employee co-piloted a helicopter from which it is alleged that the door gunner shot at a bus suspect. At a bus suspected to carry LTTE combatants as well as civilians. The door gunner allegedly continued to fire as men, women and children fled from the bus. So that's clearly a KMS employee that's responsible for this incident. Now, these papers also reveal that KMS employees and mercenaries were basically embedded in that unit. So you couldn't exactly tell them apart from the Sri Lankan personnel. So they were effectively some of the personnel that carried out these atrocities. And they are war crimes. Whatever you want to call them, these are war crimes. So it's only fair that they're investigated if that's the society we live in, where war crimes are an illegal thing to carry out.
But there comes a question, which is, we know how badly looked after British service people are, and that after they leave the services, isn't it one of the only ways for soldiers who've been trained by the British Armed Forces to make a decent living? I mean, shouldn't we allow them to work in an advisory capacity to some places, even if there are some bad apples? I mean, shining a light on this stuff doesn't help our soldiers, does it?
Well, I'd argue that if you want to look after your soldiers, look after them, support them once they retire, once they finish their career on duty, once they're back in the country. We see so many, and I've worked in homeless services, as housing services, and I've seen a lot of ex-servicemen ending up homeless. So the government could start by basically supporting them, supporting their housing, supporting their welfare and so on. And that's not done. So already I would argue that's a better way to treat the people that have worked for the state and on behalf of the state. But then it leads to the other question that, it depends what you stand for. If the British government, well, for example, let's give what happened in Sri Lanka. This took place in the 80s, and it was basically in Britain's strategic interest to repress the Tamil uprising, because there was a fear that they had links to the Soviet Union, because by and large many of them were communists. So Phil Miller obviously knows more about this than I can. So again, I would refer you to his documentary. But that's Britain's strategic interest. So the question is, how right is it that they then get involved in that country's internal affairs to pursue their own interests? Do you see what I mean? I would argue that that's wrong to start with. It's not even a question of who's carrying it out. It's that it shouldn't be carried out in the first place. And certainly not because you just can't find employment for people that used to be basically civil servants.
So, well, but isn't Britain's involvement in these things only slight? I mean, they can't oversee everything that goes on, by private military companies. Should they be held accountable? Should they be being involved in this?
Now, this is interesting that you ask, because basically Phil Miller has put in a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign Office to see some documents that they have so far refused to show him, which date back from the 80s and which apparently clearly show government involvement in KMS services actions on the ground. So there is talk that there was tacit agreement with what they were doing, but that they sought to distance themselves from it.
Right. And again, in researching this piece, you sent us a piece about, the Declassified UK, who we had on previous last week, I believe, was showing that Britain has involvement in an information war in Syria and had far more active involvement in the Syrian conflict and civil war than we were made aware of. Do you think this is widespread, that Britain's involved in a lot of internal affairs of other countries? Because the media doesn't really report on it. Maybe this is just a case of a couple of bad apples or a couple of occasions.
Well, no, I mean, it's been Britain's policy for decades, if not centuries. It was a colonial power, and I would argue that now it's by and large a neo-colonial power, in that it interferes in the interior policies of other countries to further their strategic interests. So yes, now the interesting thing with this story is that it's not quite come to light just now. I think what's happened is it's been revealed bit by bit, but there was an original story that came out and that's only if I'm putting Arab media aside, because that's been quite revelatory over the years. But from what we have as an English audience in terms of UK media, there's been since 2014, there were articles in The Guardian talking about this British involvement, training what are basically PR personnel to create these propaganda campaigns. Now, interestingly, the article was written by Ian Cobain, who's also written the Middle East Eye article that's referenced in the Declassified UK article. So over the years, I think more and more documents have come to light proving that this happened. So Britain has been involved in many ways across the globe and in the events in Syria, one of which is through the use of mercenaries. Now, I may refer you to the head of the White Helmets, if you heard of him, James Lemazurier, who died in 2019. So he used to be a British military officer, and he became a mercenary. And he was the head of the White Helmets, who were very much marketed to Western audiences as basically a neutral aid organization, but actually they were working very closely with jihadi groups on the ground, and there is video evidence of them basically collaborating with those groups. And what happened in the end is that they were used as a campaign tool, as a PR tool by Western governments, by Saudi Arabia, to discredit the Syrian government in as part of their proxy war against Russia. So as I was saying, he died in 2019. And so you were talking about the media in the UK. So there was a BBC podcast called Mayday, which was released shortly after that, and which tried to salvage his reputation, because towards the end of his life, he was accused of financial fraud, amongst other things, obviously. And then they claimed that he took his own life. He committed suicide because of accusations that the White Helmets were committing atrocities instead of actually being some sort of aid organization. And now, the other thing I was referencing were the recent article by Ian Cobain that revealed that basically Britain had been funding 5 different communications campaigns that were meant to bolster the so-called opposition groups and present them as moderate, as fighters for a democratic government in Syria, whereas in fact they were mostly offshoots of various jihadi groups. So that you can find in Middle East Eye, and it was relayed through Declassified UK. So one of the groups, for example, that was that benefited from this propaganda campaign was Jaish al-Islam, which was a sort of a coalition of about 50 Islamist factions working in the area, operating in and around Damascus, and largely funded by Saudi Arabia. So these campaigns were supported by a mix of personnel from the Ministry of Defence, from the Foreign Office. There was one, for example, cross-government initiative called the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, and one called Sarka, the Cry in Arabic, which was specifically a campaign that was launched in 2014, and it sought to encourage members of Syria's Alawite community to accept that Assad, the president, who's also a fellow Alawite, was a tyrant, and to denounce sectarianism. And that was entirely created on behalf of the British government. Now, this is not to deculpabilize the Syrian government, but it shows you to what extent the entire opposition movement in Syria was manipulated and partly created by Britain. And then it goes, I mean, I'm not going into many details, but it goes so far as to show how they funded and trained YouTube influencers, for example, social media accounts, people with very strong social media accounts following. So all these things were then trickled down to UK mainstream media like the BBC Channel 4, then Sky, and even BBC Arabic, and so on.
Right. So what we're saying is intelligence agencies created propaganda that was seen as separate and independent to shape both internal politics, but then was also used to report on to the British public. Right. And
that's it.
Again, in the Snowden files, you can see that there are links. They talk about disrupt, degrade, deny as a methodology of creating YouTube influencers, social media influencers. There's evidence of particular types of political activity that I'm not going to malign right now until I can get into the details, that particular influencers online are funded by the state, by the British state. So, and in the article, the declassified article, it talks about these techniques were brought home, like a lot of imperial experiments are brought home and utilized on the British population as well. Is that... Now, you said you hadn't gone into a lot of details. It sounded like a lot of detail. How did you find out about all this stuff? Like, how on earth do you keep on? I've not heard any of this. Even now, I've done research for this show. I didn't know. Like, how do you know about this?
Well, that's the sad thing, is that we should know more about this. Now, to be fair, the Guardian article is there to view on the Guardian website, but it was in the back pages of the newspaper. There wasn't much. It wasn't particularly highlighted at the time. In fact, one quote from the Observer of the time, so partner organization to the Guardian, saying that Britain should do more to help Syrians, and Britain's not involved enough in Syria and so on. That was the official line of the paper, despite at least having the decency to publish this article by Ian Cobain at the time.
Right, one article.
But one article, exactly, that you had to basically look out for.
Do we need like more funding for investigative journalism? Do we need more independent outlets? What should people be changing their reading habits? Because as far as I'm aware, you've told me you read mostly in Arabic, from Arabic news sources. But how are we supposed to keep on top of this, the ordinary public?
Well, it's really hard. I mean, I always say as a journalist, basically diversify your sources as much as possible. Every news outlet will have an agenda. It might be one you agree with, it might be one you disagree with, but they will have one. So the more you multiply your sources, the wider more exhaustive and comprehensive vision of the world you have. And I would say team that with education, historical understanding of the processes that lead to these things. Now, I know history. I know the history of Syria. I know the history of British involvement in Syria as well. So this is how a lot of these things make sense to me. But also, I had to know where to look. Now, yes, there are Arab language media, but there are media outlets. I'm going to cite the Grey Zone, which is one of them, which has some pretty good investigative articles, and that's why I'm so pleased to see a website like Declassified UK come to light, because that's what needs to be put out there, really, across more mainstream media, which won't cover it at all. Now, to go back to Phil Miller's point, actually, and this is just to show you that there isn't much appetite in mainstream media to show these things, on two levels, I'd say. The first one is just lack of interest. So Phil Miller pitched his documentary to Channel 4, and the reply he got was, "We've already done Sri Lanka." So it's this kind of patronizing, sneering attitude to the rest of the world, where as long as you've covered, a decade in that country, their culinary history, their music, whatever, you've done your bit. Let's move on to another one. There isn't an appetite to really reveal what goes on in the world. There's that. Then there's another level, which is, from my own experience working at the BBC, which is a sort of unconscious bias. Most heads of documentaries and producers and senior producers at the BBC are English. They work on documentaries about the Arab world without involving Arabs, or very, very few. And many of them, and again, I hate, I'm generalizing, and that's only in my experience. I should really stress
I'm going to have to move you on from all these caveats and bring this to an
Sorry,
end.
it's lots of caveats, lots of caveats.
It's a very scientific approach. Is why people can't understand scientists, right? They're like, it's probably maybe quite likely that something probably will happen, because, like, I would never say anything's definite, because
exactly. Don't quote me.
To be like precise about what I say.
But sorry, Tom. I was going to say, this has been my experience. I worked on a show that was about Lebanon, for example, and I saw the level at which senior producers lack knowledge of these countries, and have a certain patronizing attitude as to their role as British broadcasters in these countries. Now, they don't necessarily do this deliberately. It's the way they're brought up, it's the way they're educated, and it's a very privileged view of the world, which will inform the way they document what goes on in these countries. The second thing is their relationships with local people in these countries. So I joined the team to help them find local interviewees, so to speak. But they would only go through their own channels. So they'd basically phone up their mates in Lebanon and get people to speak. So in the end, it was an echo chamber, because you'd only have fairly senior, fairly privileged British journalists and broadcasters interviewing fairly privileged Lebanese broadcasters.
Right.
So
on that note, sorry, I've got to move us on to a less privileged Sheffield producer, not even a broadcaster, and say, check out the My Dial-O-Rama podcast. It's fantastic. Link is in the description. Discussions that go on at length about topics like these and so much more go on. I think I was a guest once as well, so thanks, Abla, for having me on. And as you can tell, I can go on. I apologize for that. Let's talk about Sheffield, because there's been a tree debacle there, and that at first sound doesn't sound that extraordinary, but let's talk about it. Why we need an inquiry into the Sheffield street tree debacle. So there's been an article done by Now Then, an excellent partner of this show, who do a whole range of stuff from arts, culture, investigations, news, and all sorts of stuff. And they're brilliant in so many different ways. Really do check them out. But let's talk about what occurred with the street tree debacle. Julie Dore is resigning as leader of the council. Her recent unreserved apology is not enough. Her successor should immediately launch a public inquiry into the felling of thousands of our city's trees. Russell Johnson from Sheffield Tree Action Groups, STAG, good acronym, like it, has called on the council to pay the costs incurred by campaigners who have found to have broken the injunction. This was an injunction that was designed to stop people from physically protecting street trees, many which we now know should have never been targeted for felling in the first place. The article then lists 5 reasons why this compensation should be paid, outlining council dishonesty to the courts in two significant ways: the illegality of the felling itself, so it's illegal to fell a lot of these trees, the council misleading the public, and huge sums of cash being wasted on private security, bouncers, police, and court cases. And that is, you know, as we were talking about, like the problems with councils before, they can deliver services far better than extraordinarily corrupt multinational corporations who fleece governments left, right, and centre. But as we can see in this case, maybe they're not whiter than white or cleaner than clean. So, as the article states, if Sheffield Council is genuinely sorry, reimbursement of these costs should give some credibility to that apology. Now, I want to bring in Sam Walby here from Now Then and ask him about the details of this. Sam, sorry for bringing you so late. It's been a banger, but this has
been brilliant.
Yeah. Ultimately, didn't the trees need to go? Like, it says some of the trees were illegally felled, but didn't the roads need to be fixed in Sheffield? I've been to Sheffield. The roads are terrible. Isn't this just kind of NIMBYism?
So Sheffield is one of the greenest cities in Europe. So we've got 37,000 street trees. So that's just on streets, not including the Peak District, where there's hundreds of thousands of trees. Now, some of those genuinely did need to go. But in the end, about 5,500 of them were cut down before the council really recognised that it needed to change its approach and listen more to people. It could well be the case. Sadly, we just can't say for sure because of the commercial sensitivity, in quote marks, around the PFI contract with Amy, which is the infrastructure company who's doing this work. It could well be the case that many of those older trees that were replaced with younger trees, that was only done because it would save money on maintenance for that company during the lifespan of that PFI contract. And that's the main argument for a lot of these campaigners in Sheffield, which is that even though these trees were felled and replaced like for like with young trees, was there a commercial imperative to replace those trees that really didn't need replacing just to save money for a multinational corporation? Yes, you're right. The roads in Sheffield were awful, and it became a bit of a running joke, like a lot of cities in the north. Personally, I'm far more in favour of developing infrastructure for cycling and walking, but obviously potholes are dangerous for cyclists, arguably most. But, you know, this is a rock and a hard place for council, and certainly when they opened this contract in 2012, it was signed, there wasn't a lot of money flying around, funnily enough. So, you know, a real rock and a hard place for them. And just on your point about NIMBYism, I mean, you're starting to sound quite a lot like the council, actually. You know, that's what they said, and this is where it got them into a real tangle, you know, because, you know, ultimately not in my backyard, that seems like a pretty valid excuse of a response for local people, you know, for a campaign of what is effectively environmental vandalism. You know, and the council say that Amy never had targets for felling within that contract. So they didn't have a certain number of trees they had to fell. So not in my backyard doesn't really apply here because it's not like they would have gone to another neighbourhood instead and just arbitrarily cut down a load of trees there. Or maybe they would, I don't know.
So, well, I guess that kind of semi-answers my next question, which is what would an inquiry really tell us? Because surely the damage has been done now.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of the damage has been done. I think there's a lot of trust been lost in this administration, which they'll never get back. I'm not here to advocate directly for an inquiry. Obviously, our writer is really passionate about that. I think the most recent, the proper Hillsborough inquiry that was long overdue, I think that cost South Yorkshire Police alone, it cost them about £22 million. They're not cheap, obviously. We've also never had a proper inquiry into the Battle of Orgreave, which I probably would prioritise over this as well, personally, which was rejected by Amber Rudd as Home Secretary 3 or 4 years ago. But what might we find if there was an inquiry? Well, we know that the council misled public in Sheffield on a number of issues related to trees. We don't really know the extent of that and how consciously they did that. We don't know how many trees were felled illegally, and actually because of poor record keeping within council, we might never know that. They made an argument that they were felling these trees under their obligation to highways legislation. That was shown to be false. They purposefully started cutting trees down at 5 o'clock in the morning on one street because they knew that residents were so opposed. So they were banging on doors at 5 a.m. saying, come and move your car, we're chopping these trees down. So I guess to answer your question, potentially we could be looking at a misuse of public funds and misconduct in public office. What an inquiry wouldn't tell us, because of this, and I'd like to come back to this commercial sensitivity point, is we're probably never going to know whether there was a commercial imperative to cut those trees down, because that's sealed in a contract between the council and Amy, which we will probably never see. So there was a heavily redacted version of that contract released, but we're probably never going to see the full version. We're probably never going to know if there were really targets for how many trees should be cut down and whether those targets were kept secret. Basically, anything in depth about that contract, we will probably never know.
Right. Yeah, because this leads to another question I was going to ask, which is, I mean, I was going to ask, like, how is this important in the national context? But, specifically this commercial, this has been utilised. I've spoken to journalists who've come up against this, where it's you can hide a lot of things under this clause. So does this tell us anything about PFI or local government that could be useful for others in the national context?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, on the left, we tend to be allergic to PFIs, don't we? It's like a rude word. It's like a swear word. And I think often that the focus of that is on the ideological aspect, which I personally am on board with, which is, this is work we should be financing through public bodies. We should have full oversight and understanding and not siphoning it off to the private sector. But for me, the key thing here is that we're not allowed to know so many key details about a contract which we, effectively the people, have made with this company. This heavily redacted contract, which was released after months and months of pushing through freedom of information and various other channels. There's a suggestion that the current leader of Sheffield City Council hasn't even read the contract. And I know that anybody who has seen the contract has had to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. I don't know whether the leader of Sheffield Council didn't want to see the contract because she didn't want to actually know what was in it, or whether she wasn't allowed to see it. Obviously we can kick out Sheffield City Council, and there's a good chance that the constitution of the council is going to change a lot in May anyway. But we can't kick out this private company until 2037. And their plan was, let's do all the work in 5 years and then we'll be making a profit for 20 years. I mean, that's backfired because of the actions of a lot of campaigners here. But I think, to come back to the question, in the national context, it does show us the really desperate situation that councils are in funding wise, due to austerity, but obviously due to 30, 40 years of cuts, which are all, in my opinion, related to sapping away their power and what they can actually do and the kind of wiggle room that they have. But I think that's led to a culture within a lot of local authorities where transparency and honesty and all this sort of stuff, they're not being respected. But these councils don't have the expertise, they don't have the money, they don't have the time anymore to really take a stand on these things. So this is an example of the council trying to just sort of push it to one side, and it really, really, really backfired on them. But I mean, again, to me, the biggest issue here is we're not allowed to know what's in that contract, and that secrecy, which is driven by commercial interest, undoubtedly, is really, really damaging to trust and local democracy, and it encourages distrust, it encourages paranoia, it puts everybody's backs up, and it makes people feel like they're just being completely ignored and that no one cares what they think.
Yeah, and this is the concern. And again, like, earlier when we were talking to Claire, there's already a distrust of local government, which is a problem in this pandemic, right? I mean, this report, to me, this news article raises a question about local democracy and citizens being able to shape their own environment. How, what can we do about this? How best can we see it? Because especially, I think we have a right, when we talk about shaping our own environment, not just the health of the environment, trees do a lot for health and air quality, but also what we look at, food for the soul through the eyes. Like we need this. So what do you think we can do about this, and what can we learn from these reports, from these pieces?
Well, I think we just desperately need new and genuinely meaningful ways of local people being able to engage with those decision-making processes. Councils and various other bodies are legally obliged to do consultations on certain things, but very often that's a box-ticking exercise. Very often it's an anonymous letter that comes through the post and will get ignored in most cases. They did one survey on opinions to Sheffield street trees, and I think the response rate was about 12%. because it dropped through in a completely anonymous sort of envelope. And so it's kind of gone out of fashion, like I say, particularly in Sheffield. And I think it's down to lack of resource and bandwidth and ability to actually think about this, but genuinely listening to what people think and trying to feed that in and showing them that is part of an ongoing decision-making process. I mean, if the council had nipped this in the bud early and got around the table, which they did end up doing with campaigners, this whole thing could have been avoided, and they probably would have saved money as well. And I think that their original motivation was, this is going to cost us because, and I'm speculating here, but there are probably various clauses in that contract that could have cost the council loads of money if milestones aren't hit. Now, they've obviously pushed forward with this and tried to brute force it through concerns about that. But they've actually probably ended up costing themselves and Amy, entertainingly, more money in the process, because they couldn't just get around the table and say, we understand where you're coming from, you care about your trees, which are in some cases 80 or 100 years old. It's all well and good saying you're going to replace trees like for like, but replacing a tree that's 30 foot tall with a tree that's 4 foot tall, that's a huge change in the street scene. And so I think, there were a lot of ways of dismissing those campaigners. One of them was, oh, well, they're just middle class people, and then the other one was around the political aspect. Well, these are just our political opponents of the Labour administration. What they didn't do is get around the table and say, we think your concerns are valid. What can we do to address this? They did that after 18 months, 2 years. They should have done it straight away. And we need ongoing mechanisms for people to be able to talk to people who are making these decisions.
Yeah, like this crazy tribalism, isn't it? It's like, well, first off, it's a middle class concern to have trees. It's like working class people deserve clean air and trees as well. Like, what happened to, like, how patronizing can you say that, like, us as working class people don't deserve trees in our lives, or don't like them? Oh, well, we just want roads, we just want concrete and brutalism. And secondly, like, it's an idea of like there's a certain tribalism at the local level, maybe within the Labour Party, maybe it happens in Tory councils as well. I don't know. I've never lived in one, where they just assume everyone is an opponent of Labour, and they attacked, I believe, councillors who were Green councillors. I believe in the article it describes how they were driven out. So what we need is ongoing processes where they're actually talking to the people they're supposed to represent at a very local level, because the ways that they seem to do that, these consultation stuff, they've become moribund, haven't they? They're like, they don't seem to work.
No, they don't work at all. And people don't see themselves in it. They don't see why it's important. They're not, all those decision-making processes are so opaque. I bet 98% of people in Sheffield don't realise that you can watch most council meetings through live video and actually catch-up video as well. I bet most people don't know that, even though they've spent hundreds of thousands of pounds to make that so, and that's the right thing to do. But the communication isn't there to say, here's why it's important that you engage with what is being decided in this room. And this is just one example of hundreds that you could come up with. Sheffield's got a race equality commission happening at the moment, and they're looking at 6 different areas of how racial inequality affects people's experiences living in Sheffield. And that's a really positive example of the council doing something proactive and saying, yeah, we're getting out in front of this because it's important. And we need more of that, but we also need these constant channels for citizens to actually feed in and say, this is a problem, and rather than those concerns just being dismissed as middle class people who've got nothing better to do, or political opponents who are trying to assassinate the administration.
Yeah, well, what I can suggest to viewers to do about this is, one, get on your council live stream. A lot of them do them nowadays, but secondly, read Now Then, check them out, check out Opus Independence and all the great work they do, including Festival of Debate. Sam, I'm going to tie it up here unless there's any final thoughts from you. You feel like
that's it. Thanks for having me. I said my piece.
Yeah, wonderful. It's grand. Like, this is, this is a battle that really, as we say, has uncovered stories about PFI, about freedom of information, about our relationship to our local environment, about our relationship to our local democracy, and the way that we can control the parts of the world that we live in. And I think that on top of the work that's been done by Abla with My Dialorama, are great examples of independent media doing the work that we need to expand and deepen. And that's why we encourage you to check out the link to the Media Fund in the description. And we ask you to like and subscribe and hit a bell button if you're on YouTube, so you can keep hearing this stuff, because it helps us reach people and make the changes we want to see. I also want to thank Claire for being a good sport. I'm sorry I went on so long. I had prepared a lot of questions for a very last minute, and I wanted to get them all in. She was good banter and brought up a discussion that I think a lot of us are having privately, but less so in the news. So thanks, Claire, for coming on, and thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one next week, 5 o'clock, when you're not watching council live streams. Okay, see you next week, Thursday, 5 p.m, and we'll have some great guests to announce then.